Good morning and welcome to the latest installment of Mazzetti's Bending the Climate Curve Learning Series. I'm Christina Vernon-Sanborn. I'm the Sustainability Practice Leader here at Mazzetti. We're bending the climate curve is our mission. This morning we'll introduce My Green Lab. My Green Lab is a globally recognized not-for-profit organization dedicated to building a global culture of sustainability in science. Through innovative programs like My Green Lab certification and the ACT label, My Green Lab empowers laboratories to adopt sustainable practices and make informed, environmentally responsible choices. The My Green Lab certification is the world's most trusted certification for green lab practices, helping labs worldwide reduce energy, waste, water, and chemical use. The ACT EcoLabel provides transparent, third-party verified data on environmental impact of products, enabling labs and procurement teams to make more sustainable purchasing decisions. Run for scientists by scientists, we leverage our credibility and track record to develop standards, oversee their implementation, and inspire the many behavioral changes that are needed throughout the scientific community. Though My Green Lab focuses solely on laboratory environments, we believe our activities will excite similar changes across other industries and in the private lives of millions of people who spend their time in labs. Next slide. I'm very pleased to introduce James. James Connolly is a visionary sustainability executive with a track record of growing organizations that have transformed industries in multiple sectors, including manufacturing, real estate, tech, and life sciences. Over his career, he consulted with and developed sustainability programs for some of the world's largest companies and institutions. An internationally recognized corporate sustainability expert, James has deep knowledge of ESG reporting and strategy. James was selected as a Green Biz 30 Under 30 Sustainable Business Leader in 2017 and a Net Zero Energy Trailblazer in 2019, and is passionate about rapidly catalyzing the global transition to net zero. Today's session will explore these 4 learning objectives. We will hold questions until after today's speaker has made his presentation, but we encourage you to submit your questions at any time whenever they occur to you via the Q&A function of the webinar. We'll be able to see them and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Today's session is being recorded. Next slide. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. Today's event qualifies for 1 AIA Health, Safety, and Welfare CEU. If you didn't provide your AIA number 1 registration, please send it to info@mazzetti.com. All right. So don't forget to enter your questions into the Q&A and we will get started. I will turn it over to James. James?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christina. I'm very excited to be here with Mazzetti's Bending the Climate Curve session, a goal and a vision that we share as well at My Green Lab. So we'll go ahead and share my screen. Make sure it gets the right slide. Here we go. Okay. So what we're going to talk to you today, as Christina so helpfully set us up, is both how we bend the climate curve generally and specifically what we're doing to build a global culture of sustainability and science to transform the scientific industry. And I just want to maybe place this in the context. While what we do at My Green Lab is very laser focused on labs and laboratory operations, that touches on a lot of different practice areas that many, I think, on this call and across the industry work on. So that's healthcare and hospital labs, university labs, really any place where there's fume hoods, freezers, and people are doing scientific research, which tend to have a significant amount of impact. And so that's really our mission. Our mission is to build a global culture of sustainability and science to transform the industry into global leader on environmental sustainability. We do this through education, community engagement, and market-leading certification tools, ultimately inspiring the scientific community to integrate sustainability into everything they do. Our long-term vision is a world where all science is conducted in a way that benefits the health and well-being of people and our planet. And a lot of what we're doing, and I know many people on this call come from the building industry, and interestingly enough, I myself am actually an architect. I spent the first 10 years of my career in the green building industry. And I think where we're at in science is really where we were in the green building industry 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago, uh, where people are just now learning, one, that there's a big environmental impact, and they're learning that they need to do something about it. I think we've been able to drive an incredible cultural transformation in buildings with a growing number. I think it was over 20,000 lead APs. We're just at the beginning of that transformation in science. But there's many ways that those in the building industry can actually support to advance their customer and their client goals in this space. So many people are not aware that laboratories are massively resource intensive spaces. They can use up to 10 times more energy than a traditional commercial office space, up to 4 times more water. And laboratories, and this was actually from a study in 2015 that just looked at academic research, produce 5.5 million metric tons of plastic waste each year. That's actually 2% of the global total. And again, that's just looking at academic research. If we factor in clinical diagnostic, biopharma production, that number is significantly higher. Suffice it to say, life science in the laboratory industry generally has a massive and growing footprint. We do a study each year that we release along with the Global Climate Conference, COP, which will be held in Brazil this year. And last year's study found that laboratories were close to 400 million metric tons of CO2 annually, which was more than 1,000 natural gas-fired power plants. So the impact is significant, and there's lots of opportunities to drive change and reduction. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the opinion, which is maybe kind of the opinion of the building industry 15 or 20 years ago, is that it's too hard to create change. It's too regulatory. The research is too important. And so our program was one of the first tools to provide a proven process to reduce impact in what was considered one of these really challenging arenas, both laboratories and lab supply chains. At the time, there weren't any third-party verified standards. And we created the first My Green Lab certification, which is internationally recognized as the gold standard for laboratory sustainability best practice. And one of the great things about My Green Lab certification is we see it not only has environmental impact reductions, it also delivers real financial savings for the lab, greater than 5x in 1 year alone. And just like the building industry, while it's important to change the lab itself, it's actually the vast value chain of materials and where those materials go at the end of their life that makes up the majority of the overall impact of the industry. So again, there wasn't any third-party certification standards for laboratory equipment and supply besides Energy Star for freezers. And so we created the first independent third-party standard measuring the environmental performance of laboratory products, equipment, and supplies called ACT. There was a lot of companies that were putting a green leaf on products. We saw that quite often actually in this industry. Coming from the building industry, we would never accept somebody claiming that a product met certain sustainability criteria without it first having a third-party verification to a well-known, respected standard. We're trying to bring that same rigor to the life science industry, again, maybe about 10, 15 years behind the building industry. So the way that My Green Lab certification works, it's very different than a program like LEED, maybe a little bit more similar to a program like LEED eBOM, if you're familiar, because it's about the operation of the lab itself, and it's about the behaviors, policies, and practices of the people working within the lab, the researchers, as well as those that are supporting research, such as facility managers, lab managers, asset managers, lab technicians, etc. The way our program works is we actually get nearly everybody in the lab, and actually we ask in the 1.3 version of the program that over 50% of people within the lab take a very comprehensive survey. It takes about 30 to 45 minutes to complete, has 175 questions, and the focus is on what can people actually do by changing their behavior or policies or practices to drive impact. So I want to distinguish, it's actually not a certification about the design of laboratories, it's a certification about the operation and what people can do to drive impact. One of the benefits means it can apply to any lab, and it's also not very capital intensive because a lot of the suggestions that we make don't necessarily require major equipment changes and upgrades, although some of the bigger picture things you can do where you can really get a lot of energy savings in a lab do require modification and tuning of the ventilation system, for example. So first we come in and we assess a baseline. Takes 3 to 5 weeks. About 50% participation is required. Some organizations actually require higher than that. For example, Biogen and AstraZeneca require that anybody involved in the lab go through the assessment process. That gives us a really good baseline of understanding of what people are doing and best practice. We also find it's really important not to just survey the sustainability champion or the lab lead, because often they have a very different opinion about what's actually going on in the lab than when you look at a broader cross section. We get those survey results. We then make suggestions. Labs have a period of time to implement changes. Takes between 6 to 8 months on average. We're trying to tighten that up, and some labs are now able to do it closer to 3 months. Then they take the assessment again, and it's at that second stage that they actually receive certification. So it's a true continuous improvement process. And then at that second stage, when they get their certification, we make more recommendations for improvement. And because there's so much turnover in labs, and the state of best practice, the state of technology is always constantly changing, it's really important that we come back and do recertification on a regular basis. So we do that every 2 years. Labs then receive a certification score, which would be familiar with many of you with a tool like LEED or BREEAM, bronze being the lowest score. For our system, green is the highest, above platinum. Most labs, when they come in and they first do the baseline assessment, even those that tell us in advance, hey, we're really advanced. We know we've had a green lab program for a long time. When we survey everybody in the lab, typically they score in the silver and bronze level. It's certainly possible within that 3 to 6, sometimes a bit longer pathway to get up to gold or even platinum through implementing better training, policy, behavior change. Getting to the green level is a significant achievement. It requires changing some of the organization's policies. For example, policies around procurement of more sustainable materials, looking at issues like waste, doing a waste audit and figuring out whether there's alternative methods they could reduce the amount going to landfill, or worse yet, getting autoclaved and incinerated if it's regulated medical waste. Or even bigger picture changes like how they manage their equipment. One of the recommendations we make is people chill up their freezers from -80 to -70. We have a lot of research that shows that actually sample integrity is just as good at -70 as -80. But the recovery times maybe not as quick if power goes out. So it really has to be an overall organizational-wide decision where they're really looking carefully about how they manage their equipment and their fleet. So we have now actually 41 of the top 50 biotech and pharma companies around the world that have adopted the program. I've been in the CEO seat the past 5 years. Started at the organization actually as a strategic advisor. Then I joined the board. And then ultimately the board asked me to take on the CEO role. And one of the things we saw is, while the tool was designed originally for academic research labs, it actually worked really well in the corporate R&D environment. And so while we do serve lots of academic institutions around the world, where we've seen the biggest growth is through some of the largest pharmaceutical companies that have significant scientific operations and are looking to align their scientific operations with their higher level and many very aggressive corporate sustainability goals. You can see some of these companies also now have top-down strategies. So what initially began, sort of like the way um, the green building movement began with a bunch of interested professionals trying to get this idea off the ground, now it's actually being embedded within corporate sustainability. So companies like AstraZeneca actually have a goal to certify all of their labs, and they do it every single year as a way to maintain their sustainability efforts. And we're hoping more labs continue down that pathway. One of the things I wanted to mention, as Christina and I were talking before the webinar, is a lot of, I know this audience works in healthcare institutions. Healthcare institutions are also very high energy consuming spaces, but it's not just the patient spaces and it's not just the operating theaters. It's also the labs or the core lab facilities that either serve that hospital or are on site at that hospital as well. So we've been quickly growing in the clinical lab space. We have 60 plus clinical labs, and often the savings potential for a lot of those core labs is even greater than the R&D context, just because there's so much throughput, particularly when you're talking about issues like waste. So since the program started in 2015, we now have over 3,800 labs in 51 countries. We also are seeing greater than 90% renewal rate. So companies are really seeing that going through the program and maintaining their certification is driving value. And that's a real broad diversity of organization. So not just top 50 biotech and pharma or large academic institutions or large hospital systems, really a broad swath of over 400 plus organizations. And the program is continuing, and we expect it to continue to grow exponentially. Again, reminding me of kind of where we were at in green building 10 to 15 years ago. So while the lab certification is important and really kind of the flagship program that we run, one of the other really important things, if we look at the overall impact of the industry, is making sure that the lab's supply chain is also driving the right sustainability outcomes. If you look at a typical university, just to give you one statistic, around 50% of the carbon emission typically comes from its research labs. And sorry, I should qualify this. If you look at a typical research university, and also about 50% of the university's spend goes in to either building or supplying those labs. So suffice it to say, both in academic institutions, biotech and pharma, as well as healthcare, all that lab purchasing and then the downstream impact has a huge overall environmental impact and has to be shifted, just like the supply chain of the building industry. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of progress. Like I mentioned, some companies were putting green leafs or they were coming out with a few hero sustainability products. And so we did a study with Agilent to understand what customers really wanted out of their lab suppliers. And one thing we found is that 82% of labs have already adopted some sustainability measures, and 85 of those expect their vendors to support them in reaching their sustainability goals, both now and into the future. And 91% of respondents, and this would not be surprising to anybody, I think, in the building industry, value an independent third-party certification. So they don't just want to hear from the manufacturer that this is their quote unquote green product. They want it to be evaluated to a third-party standard. That's why we launched the ACT label program in 2018. It's really like a nutrition facts that rates how a product performs in sustainability related categories, looking across the full life cycle impact of the product, from manufacturing of the product to energy used and the actual performance of the product in use, to the end of life. So you can really think of it as like a life cycle analysis light that gives the consumer, the researcher, the corporate purchasing person, the ability to understand and evaluate how the product performs against products within a similar category in a really nice, sort of easy to understand package. To date, we have, I think, over 50 manufacturers that have gone through the program and close to 1,000 or more than 1,250 products certified. So most of the big names that you would hear in the industry, Thermo Fisher, Eppendorf, Millipore Sigma, as well as a lot of really interesting smaller organizations that are coming up with more sustainable solutions. And it covers really everything in a lab. So consumables, chemicals, and reagents. I think what is most relevant for building professionals is we do look at equipment. So as you're speccing out freezers, autoclaves, if your scope of work includes looking at things like centrifuges, we actually have a way for you to identify and select more sustainable pieces of equipment. So it's currently the only third-party certified eco-label in this category that looks at everything, equipment, chemicals, and consumables. So you could kind of think of it like Green Guard. We do work with Energy Star. Energy Star does certify some freezers within the lab category, some ultra low freezers, as well as some other categories. And in fact, getting an Energy Star certification is a minimum criteria for determining your user consumption of energy within the ACT label program. But ACT goes much beyond. It's not just efficiency, it's looking at manufacturing and end of life, as I mentioned previously. So the program has been growing quite quickly. I misspoke earlier. I guess I said 50 plus, but let's revise that to 60 plus manufacturers, close to 2,000 products that we're estimating that are kind of going under audit right now. We think that number is going to grow closer to 5,000 by the end of 2025. So we're seeing this program really start to catch on. One thing I'll note, though, is it has to come from the consumer. So it's just like in the building industry when companies like Kaiser Permanente, Google, Microsoft started putting out requirements that any product that they bought had indoor air quality certifications and then met certain toxic chemical reductions, things like HBDs and Declare. And the architecture firms got behind this movement. It was only through that customer demand. And I think what's more important than just asking suppliers is it's got to go in the RFP. If there's something in the RFP saying we need you to have this sustainability certification or we're not going to buy from you, that actually helps the supplier because that gives that sustainability manager, that corporate EHS manager, the firepower to go up to their management and say, hey, we need to prioritize spend because this is the expectation of our customers. So we're really hoping to see that the curve bend significantly on that over the next year. So to date, we're making great progress. We have over 5,000, great progress in a sense, maybe let me qualify that. There's over 3,800 labs that have gone through My Green Lab certification, but we know there's actually over 500,000 labs globally, about 250,000 analytical and R&D labs, and another 250,000 clinical and diagnostic labs. So we're still just scratching the surface. We've had 42,000 scientists go through our program. Less than 0.5% of the scientists we know are out there globally. And we have 2,000 lab products. That's still less than 0.25% of just the number of lab products that are in the Fisher Scientific catalog. So we know we got to go further and faster to accomplish our long-term vision. Fortunately, the market is maturing in this space, which is really important. First, the US EPA had done a huge evaluation of a number of different third-party certifications and standards to make sure that anything used in federal purchasing actually met the highest international best practice standards for certification standards, both in how the standards developed and how it's audited. There's also been really a maturing of the industry. And again, similar to the building industry where doing a few things, maybe having some recycled flooring, getting some indoor air quality certifications for some of your paints. Those were good, important first steps. Now we've moved into a posture where truly it's about how are you driving the highest quality certification standards and getting at energy consumption targets that are best in class and getting those verified with real data showing progress over time. So we're seeing that for particular our larger biotech and pharma customers, they need credible third-party standards aligned with international best practice. And then along came the EU Green Claims Directive, a sweeping new legislation that says by 2026, any product that makes an environmental claim has to have it third-party verified, and it has to be done to an independent standard. That's sweeping new legislation, and many of you are probably wondering in the U.S. Well, it seems like the U.S. federal government's backing off and away from their sustainability requirements. Well, that may be true under the current administration. Most of the large companies that we work with are still selling into the EU market. So they're still going to have to comply with the corporate sustainability directive, and they're absolutely going to have to comply if they're selling products and making sustainability claims in the EU market. And I really would encourage people not to underestimate the power of those type of legislations in markets that are those significant. Just like every single website you visit now is GDPR compliant, when companies approach their sustainability strategy, they're not going to make vague and misleading sustainability claims in the US and then make accurate and verifiable claims in the EU. Instead, they're going to raise the game, raise the bar for how they perform across all markets, just like in the US when California passes aggressive emission standards, all the vehicle manufacturers rise to those standards. So we actually aren't seeing a slowdown within our private clients, and we're seeing actually a bit of an acceleration with our European based companies, and many of the companies in our space operate both in the EU and US. So we think this will likely be a bit more of a blip and probably not a lot of progress at the federal level, but there'll probably be a counter reaction if we have a change of administration in 4 years. So fortunately, we've been going through this process of revising and updating our certification ever since we knew about these new EU rule or new EPA rules that also weren't just the US standard, it was actually the US aligning with international standards for high quality certifications. So we've been working on revising and updating our standards through a formal stakeholder consensus process for My Green Lab certification starting in 2022 and ACT starting in 2023. We have formally launched My Green Lab certification January 30th, 2025, and we have the full commercial launch of the ACT label program in Q1 2025. Both programs now meeting both US EPA requirements as well as the EU Green Claims Directive, and making some other really, I think, fundamental changes that just improve them. So in order to be a true third-party certification standard, one of the things My Green Lab had to do is launch a new third-party verification entity. So those of you who lived through the LEED days, when LEED introduced GBCI, it was for the same reason. You don't want your standard setting organization to be the same as your auditing organization. Or if you're familiar with UL, there's UL and UL Solutions. That is actually its delivery arm. I mean, this is common of all third-party verification standards. So we needed to come up to international best practice, and we did that through launching this new subsidiary. We needed it to align with international best practice, but the way that we wanted to set it up is rather than going out to the market and finding a different third-party certification organization where any potential revenue or potential profits would go to that entity, we wanted it to be able to come back and actually serve the nonprofit organization's mission, the parent company's mission. In addition, people really liked the delivery of the tool as it is now. So we wanted to retain the quality, integrity, and customer focus of our current programs. This allows us to have more resources so that we can provide free tools to the market and accelerate transformation more quickly. And all parts of the organization are aligned behind a common vision. So even though it's a separate legal entity and there are clear firewalls on how the auditing and verification process is done, ultimately there's a shared vision of the world that both organizations are trying to create. So the new Certification 2.0 is enhanced in a number of ways that I'll go over here. First, when we do the initial impact assessment, we don't just have everybody fill out the same survey. We have a shorter survey for most people, and then we have a lab administrator that really kind of quarterbacks the process themselves. They go through and they work with our impact laboratories reviewer team to provide tailored feedback on what's going to be most effective for them to drive change. We then have a project management tool. We built our own software so people can understand the changes that they're making, how they implement them over time. And then we built out now an impact estimator tool. So when they submit for certification, they don't just get their score, which shows how they're benchmarked against their peers. It also shows them, based upon the level of fidelity of information they input onto the tool, what their estimated savings is going to be through implementing those actions. And then that's actually audited and reviewed by the Impact Laboratories team. So they're getting a third-party certified program that also is measuring their impact. Similarly, it has a 2-year recertification cycle. The benefit now is that labs get to maintain access to the software tools so they can see their progress and use it like a true project management tool over time. So we wanted to ensure that we remained the world's most trusted green lab certification, and we had kind of 4 guiding principles in this update process. First was rigor. So we wanted to maintain integrity without making it too difficult and bureaucratic of a process. We wanted to ensure that we could drive real impact with lasting measurable change. We wanted it to be scalable because we could see under our current IT systems and the structure of the program that we weren't going to be able to meet the massive and growing customer demand we are seeing. And then we wanted to make sure that the tool was accessible to all the various types of labs that we worked, and then tailored and actually flexible to work within each one of those environments. So to do that, we built this new software platform that measures engagement impact. It's reduced survey length, it has a beautiful UX. You can do it on your cell phone, or if you're a lab administrator or an executive of an organization, a sustainability executive, you can see everybody in a single dashboard and see the savings you're able to drive. We've weighted questions. So it used to be all questions were kind of worth the same. Now those that are going to drive bigger impact or more difficult to implement have higher weighting. And we also have third-party certification, which is obviously super critical in this context where particularly in the EU, but I think general consumer sentiment is looking for trusted, verifiable claims. So the 3 pillars of the tool now include the survey. So our engagement survey that's looking at everybody in the lab, getting a good sense of what their best practices are. Our assessment tool, which is really sort of our project management tool, so you can start to implement things over time. You can set deadlines. You can proactively upload documentation, and we also have a bunch of resources that support you through that process. And then we also have the impact estimator that drives scientifically based results on what is the actual savings that you're seeing both for carbon, water, chemicals, as well as financial ROI. So Impact Laboratories overall is the administrator of the program, but the way that the software tool works is we allow each organization then to have its own admin that can manage the internal processes. They then identify a lab lead for each lab. And many of the organizations we work with have over 200 labs. And the cool thing to see is just like we saw with lead, we're starting to see people job titles that are My Green Lab Coordinator across AstraZeneca or across a university. Those lab leads then engage the lab personnel as well as those other support functions. And so we're kind of administrating from a true third-party verification, but we're giving people the tools and the framework and guidance so they can get both their labs as well as those associated functions involved. So we just finished up our pilot, and the results were actually pretty fantastic to see. Of the 12 labs that participated, the 1 year data showed an average of 5x return on investment for commercial labs and 17x for academic labs. The program is much cheaper. It's only $500 a lab for academic labs, so the ROI is higher, even though the savings is a little bit lower. Most academic labs also just tend to be smaller, so there's less savings potential for those labs. We've also then, as I mentioned, been revising and updating ACT 2.0. So with this, we needed to better communicate sustainability attributes. I think the 1 to 10 scale, maybe while simplifying things, wasn't getting users what they needed. For example, on recycled renewable content, they wouldn't want to know whether it got a 1 or a 10, 1 or a 10. It'd want to know how much renewable content does that product have. Similarly, for the lifetime, they wouldn't want to know how it scores on the lifetime. They would want to know what its functional lifetime actually is. So we've revised the program to be a bit more transparent about what the scores mean. And we've also set it up to facilitate portfolio-wide certification. So we make it much easier for manufacturers, instead of sort of doing a product-by-product evaluation, to take every product in a particular factory, score everything about that factory, everything about the company, and then they just need to build out that basic bill of materials information for the specific products that are being manufactured within that facility. And then we can actually audit that all in a much more efficient manner. Obviously, as I mentioned, it was approved by the US EPA, and the US EPA approval is following the same best practice that the EU will be implementing, and we're working and currently pursuing accreditation within the European Union as well. And then we made it one single global label. For the manufacturers that we work with, there's a few that just manufacture regionally, for example, in the US or the UK, but the majority of companies we work with actually sell into a global market. So we wanted to have a single global label that would make it more simple for their marketing claims around the world. So now we have some additional market drivers that are pulling things into the future, which is really exciting. And I think similar to market drivers that existed that drove lead to global adoption 10 to 15 years ago. First, we're starting to see some of the largest scientific funders say, if you want to get grant funding from us, then you need to pursue My Green Lab certification. So the Wellcome Trust and Cancer Research UK, as well as Science Foundation Ireland, are now pushing those requirements. We were hopeful we were going to get some traction with the NIH around this, given other global funders. That's probably not in the cards, at least for the next 4 years. But there's a lot of private funders of scientific research, and the beauty we see is even if a university receives just a few percentage points of its funding from one of these private funders, it actually can influence their policies overall. ACT was approved by the US EPA. So actually the written requirements are that US federal agencies are required to use any approved standard to the maximum extent possible for purchasing. I think there's just going to be a lot of chaos currently with the federal government. So we'll see how that plays out. But again, it's aligned with where the European Union is moving as well. And I think a clear mark of quality of the standard and certification for us. And then we've also now got 7 of the largest pharma companies united to actually require anybody who does business with them within their supply chain, and that there's actually a lot more companies that do contract research development, or contract manufacturing than there are the big logos and names that you might be more familiar with. We're getting them to push that down their supply chain. And we're also working with some of the larger healthcare systems to incorporate ACT into RFP requirements. Kaiser's already done that. and we're going to be working with some of the large pharma companies. So again, just like in the building industry, you get some of those bigger purchasers to start saying, hey, if you want to work with us, here are our expectations, and you can actually drive market transformation quite quickly and quite credibly. So another program that I want to mention, which is maybe relevant to all of you, is if you just want to kind of dip your toes in and learn about green labs, you work in life science or that's a portion of your client base, we have a really fun tool that just gives you a basic introduction of what are the things that you can do within a lab. We then tie that together in a global community. I think we have actually closer to 9,000 ambassadors now in over 90 countries, and then we have monthly calls so you can network with other like-minded professionals. That just takes a couple hours to complete. The program has been growing quickly, and what we find is sort of just like, the first lead APs within an office, these people start to become the de facto sustainability leaders within their organization. Tied to that, not just a free program, but people that want to go much more in depth, we've developed a My Green Lab accredited professional program. So you could think of this as like a lead AP, and I've been a lead AP since 2008. The way this program is quite a bit different is it's much more educational. So you do learn some details about the certification program, but it's more focused on the conceptual issues. What do you do about reducing water consumption in a lab? Not just what are the credit requirements within My Green Lab certification. So they're great programs. It's a great tool. And we also offer bulk discounting for corporations or for universities or nonprofits. So it's a great way to really sort of upskill and then demonstrate to your clients that you're knowledgeable about these issues. So just to kind of bring it home here, I'm going to try to wrap up quickly. We have a suite or an ecosystem of tools and programs that's working to achieve our mission of building a global culture of sustainability and science. We have our core certification programs, My Green Lab certification and ACT. And then we do a bunch of education and advocacy that we actually offer either free or super discounted. So we have a freezer challenge, which is a fun, friendly way labs can compete to reduce the energy consumption of their freezers. We have the ambassador program, and we have the My Green Lab accredited professional. We then are working on some broader campaigns where we're partnering with organizations like the UN-backed Race to Zero, where we're actually getting companies that have committed to the Race to Zero to demonstrate progress on their labs. And they actually set a goal that 95% of labs for companies in the UN Race to Zero should be My Green Lab certified by 2030. And then we're partnering with some of the larger scientific funders in the world to get them to actually drive requirements for their grantees. So we're working kind of from the individual grassroots level all the way to bigger systemic and policy change. And if you want to learn more about the future direction of the organization, you can download our 2025 to 2027 strategic plan. Within this, we're really trying to transform what has been sort of a grassroots nascent movement into something that's as transformative as the building industry. We know we need to move from pilot programs to organization-wide initiatives. Labs and corporations actually have to adopt full-time staff so that they can have the resources they need to succeed. It shouldn't just be somebody doing it off the corner of their desk. And with the potential savings, we think it's justified financially. We need more incentives, not just a few. We need all of the biggest private scientific funders to require these things. We need better data. We need that data to be auditable in a way it can go in corporate sustainability reports. And we got to get rid of all these first-party claims. And truly, they will actually be illegal starting in 2026 and move to credible third-party sustainability claims. Ultimately, that's moving the industry towards a reality where green labs are the norm, not the exception. And I think it's important just to kind of hit home the difference between My Green Lab and impact laboratories that I mentioned to you previously. So while both organizations have a shared vision, My Green Lab is really a social, or actually we're now calling it a scientific movement. It's about getting everybody who's interested in this issue educated and aware and giving them the tools to go out and drive adoption within their own organization. They also develop the certification standards that are high quality and very rigorous. That's then paired with a climate tech verification company that has the technology tools to be able to deliver third-party certification at scale. And both organizations then share a bedrock of core values. So our ambition by 2030 is that a thriving culture of sustainability exists at every leading organization in science, and that we think maybe now more than ever, science needs to lead the world on addressing zero carbon, starting with its own footprint and inspire the rest of the world's industries to follow suit. And thereby accomplishing that, we think we can accomplish our 2050 vision, which is that every individual in science is fluent in sustainability, that every lab is green, and every laboratory product is designed to minimize environmental impact, and that all science is conducted in a way that benefits the health and well-being of people and our planet. And with that, I'll hand it over for questions.
Thank you so much, James. That was fascinating, and I'm excited to learn you're also an architect who's moved into this space, as am I. All right, so we have a couple of questions coming in, and I encourage all of you to enter your questions in the Q&A. And there's a Q&A function, and you can enter your questions there. So let's get started with some of the questions that we have. Is there a technical description of your methodology on how comparisons to the peer group work? This comes from Clark Reed from Energy Star. So he's thinking about how does this methodology really work to be able to create comparison?
Yeah, so maybe we'll address the qualitative aspects for My Green Lab certification first. So for My Green Lab certification, everybody within the lab has to take a survey. Based upon those survey results, we can understand how they compare against their peers. And then they have to fill out what we call an assessment. It's essentially a list of the best practices that that lab should be implementing if it was going to achieve the highest levels of environmental performance. We have the system tailored so that, for example, you're a lab that doesn't have freezers, that would be excluded from the scoring methodology. And so that allows us to get a pretty good qualitative baseline measurement from a management standpoint of how that lab performs. Within the ACT label, since Energy Star to date has decided not to address other types of equipment within the lab, so let's say autoclaves, centrifuges, analytical equipment. We are actually working with each manufacturer going through the program to develop a standard and common testing methodology so that the score showing up on the label saying that it uses X amount of energy or X amount of water a year is comparable to each other. We don't yet have enough data because we haven't been able to get enough pieces of equipment to go through the program to then do what Energy Star does, which is start to draw specific statistical analysis comparisons to say this product is better than another, but at least we're developing the testing methodology and getting the data out in the world about what the energy consumption of that piece of equipment is. One thing that was really surprising and frankly like a little bit shocking to me is most manufacturers actually don't have a standard testing methodology that would get them what the typical energy consumption of that piece of equipment
Yeah,
would be in common usage. They just sort of size it to what the electrical engineer is going to need to make
the
sure that
same in
they can
medical
serve the
equipment.
load. Yep, exactly. And so, sort of first step is just getting those standard testing methodologies, and then that causes a bit of a learning within the company itself. And they start thinking about, well, hey, actually, how could we drive that down and improve it? If Energy Star were ever to want to add those categories, we'd love to share the data and would be excited to partner. But we'll continue moving forward and hopefully getting more and more data that will be valuable in driving those benchmarks over the medium term.
So Park also asked, are US labs compared to all or just to US labs? So are you looking at this regionally or and globally when you're looking at the performance across the My Green Lab participants?
Yeah, it's a great question. So right now, the way that everybody's benchmarked is global. We do and have done some evaluation to look at regional differences, and we do want to build within our tool actually the ability for a lab that goes through the verification process to say, okay, how do I stack up in the US? How do I stack up globally? How do I stack up in particular regions of the world? Our assumption is some of the labs, particularly in the Nordic countries or in European countries that have a bit more strict environmental regulations might score a little higher. What we do see, though, is often US labs that score low at the beginning are able to implement changes pretty quickly. So right now it's a global standard, but we'd like to be able to provide that more regional specific data. I think that would be really interesting.
Um, Another question on the same theme. How many US labs have been certified in the US
It's a good
at
question.
this
I don't know
point?
off the top of my head. If we look at our global breakdown, it's about 50-50 between North America and Europe, with just a few labs outside that in Asia Pacific or South America. But roughly half of the labs that we've certified are in the US. And if you send me a note, I could get you the specific number. We have the data. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
Um, Also asks, do you have data on how much energy a certified migrant lab uses compared to a typical lab on average? Like, do we have some information about that benchmarking question we were talking about?
Yeah, so what I was able to share, and I'll maybe just pop back to the slide, is what the savings that we're able to derive from the impact estimator were for the pilot labs. And since we just rolled out the pilot, which has this new impact estimator tool, and then will be rolling that out to all My Green Lab certifications, we're going to get better and better impact estimator data. One thing that I think is really important to point out is this is not a whole building evaluation. So we're not assessing the EUI of that lab. What we're assessing is the reduction from the actions that they're taken based upon the specific location and the impact estimator tool that we have implemented. The International Institute for Sustainable Labs, in partnership with Berkeley National Lab, does have a labs benchmarking tool that looks at overall EUI performance of labs in various regions around the country, which is probably more the data that would be useful if you're an architect or an engineer. What we're looking at is through the information we can glean from the actual changes they're making, what is the savings potential, if that makes sense. And it wouldn't really be helpful for us to provide those type of benchmarking comparisons because sometimes we're looking at a brand new lab, just built in an area with a very strict energy code. Sometimes we're looking at a very old university lab. And so, really what we're looking at is operational changes and what we can glean from the impact of those operational changes. We're not looking at whole building energy consumption and making comparisons from that perspective.
Great. Lastly, from Clark, does My Green Labs have a directory of certified locations? So are the labs that get their certification celebrated in some way on your website or identified?
Yeah, so it's another great question. We don't. And so one of the requirements within EPA's program is that we begin publishing a directory. A lot of the relationships that we had with labs previously, and it's sort of just frankly a knee-jerk reaction in biotech and pharma, is that everything is done under NDA and they don't want that information to be published. So with our new certification contracts, and we're actually trying to go back and revisit some of those privacy requirements so that we can get a comprehensive directory, or even if companies want to keep it private, just like in the lead online database, we can have an opportunity for an NDA. The ACT program, though, is completely public. So on act.mygreenlab.org, you can find every single label ever created, ever verified. And that's a bit more of the consumer-facing tool. But over time, we do plan to do that. That's in our medium-term timeline and horizon, but we have to clean up our contractual relationships first.
I understand that. That's always a concern. How do we balance the privacy needs with the need to be transparent? It's always a struggle. So getting back to the ACT certification, we have a question about whether any autoclave manufacturers have signed up, and how would somebody find out if they're looking for a particular type of equipment? How would they go and find out whether there are ACT certified um, vendors in the world?
Yeah, so just if you visit act.mygreenlab.org, you can actually filter by equipment type. So you could just filter by autoclaves. We did have some units from a company called Priorclave. Their certification has lapsed, and we do right now have products from Consolidated, which is a US manufacturer of autoclaves. We also on our website published an autoclave impact study where we detailed out a testing verification methodology for the industry. I will say again, it really comes down to driving this from the consumer side. The autoclave manufacturers don't necessarily want to have to do a bunch more testing and verification of their products in order to create comparability unless they hear from their consumers that it's really important. The way that we did it is we actually got a group of autoclave manufacturers together. We looked at the various typologies and then we figured out a testing methodology that would be comparable between them. And that's how we're looking at products. We do have more in the pipeline, but again, it really does take the customers pushing the manufacturers to get them to go through a third-party verification process.
And we all have a role to play.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I really would like not underestimate how powerful it can be. It is not uncommon that we have a major manufacturer come up to us and say, "Hey, I talked to, person A at Harvard, and they told me it's really important to get a third party verification. So we're going to do that for our company." So all of you have an incredible role to play. And then ultimately, again, as I mentioned, some of the big purchasers of those products, be they healthcare systems or large pharma companies, need to just start putting it in their RFP requirements. And what I've seen is as soon as a company loses just one job because they couldn't meet that sustainability criteria, all of a sudden they're going to bring their whole portfolio up to that spec.
Great. Well, thank you so much, James, for this presentation today. We really appreciate it. And we've had lots of great questions today. Thank you for the dialogue, everyone. James, if you wouldn't mind, stop sharing your screen. And Amber, if you would mind showing next month's event. We're very excited to be hosting Scott Sepsi, who's actually on the call today, next month in our session. And he's going to be talking about Princeton's decarbonization journeys. It will be held on March 18th at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 Eastern. It's always on the third Tuesday, so you can go ahead and mark your calendars now for the rest of the year. And he's going to be sharing their progress to date. They have some pretty impressive goals that they've put in place for their big anniversary coming up. And I'm really looking forward to the presentation. I've seen Scott present in another setting, and I think you will all find this to be very interesting to look at how to do this at the scale of a campus, whether it's higher ed or education or pharma. When you're talking about a complex campus, this talk will be interesting to you. So please mark your calendars. It'll be a special treat for everyone. All right, with that, thank you. Thank you again, James. Thank you to all of you who participated today and for your great questions and dialogue. And we'll see you again next month.
Thanks so much.